Hello and welcome to today's webinar, asking what is the hidden impact of remote working on workplace culture. My name is Bogdan Tiganov and I'm the head of content and community at Ciphr. Ciphr is a specialist provider of SaaS, HR, payroll, recruitment and learning software through our HCM platform Ciphr Connect. Ciphr Connect is designed to provide a frictionless people experience across an organization's entire employee lifecycle. Also enables seamless integration not only with Ciphr's own solutions, but also to an ecosystem of specialist third-party tools using our modern API technology. One of those partners is Totem, and I'm happy to say that joining me today are Marcus Thornley, the creator of Totem, and Jamie Horne, product manager of Totem. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Bogdan.
Just to go over the agenda for today. So today we'll examine what is really happening to workplace culture as we all work remotely, the impact this has had on HR, employees, teams, and organizations, how leaders can build processes for a remote or hybrid workforce, and how HR can then start building better workplace culture. By the way, this webinar is being recorded, so if you're watching live, the recording will be emailed to you tomorrow. That's the 19th of February. So we're going to start off today with a quick poll asking, how do you think your company has handled employee engagement during the pandemic? I'm just going to launch that now. Please choose one of the options showing on your screen. And while people are doing that, Marcus, hello. Just wondering if you've seen any changes in the last year in terms of companies reaching out, looking for more actionable way of tracking engagements.
Thanks, Bogdan, and hi everyone. Yes, we certainly have. We'll allude to it later. We saw a big spike in engagement at the beginning of lockdown in the UK, so April time. And then a quite significant drop in kind of May and June, and since the summer we've been having far more conversations with people about ways that they can address employee engagement when they don't necessarily have the office as a crutch or a stage to fall back on.
I'm just going to close the poll now, show you the results. Not sure if that reflects what you were saying, what you're saying there, Marcus.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. Yeah, I mean, look. We've done well, and thankfully it's gone down fine. Is great. You know, that's almost 40%. Clearly, the majority are seeing engagement dropping, and it's interesting that two ends of the spectrum, thankfully small, but you know, pretty much mirror each other. So I think what we've seen is for the most part, teams have done phenomenally in a situation that could never have been foreseen. And held together admirably, but there's a general understanding that driving engagement is far harder than it used to be. The normal levers that we had until lockdown don't necessarily exist. You know, and I think lots of people are looking for new strategies and tools that can help them.
Cool. I'm just going to hide the poll now, and it's over to you, Marcus.
Thank you. Thanks, Bogdan. Thanks, everyone. My name's Marcus Thornley. I'm the founder of Totem. Totem's a digital culture platform that builds company culture wherever your team's working. And there's two parts to our platform. One is an engagement app that drives community, connection, and recognition across dispersed teams. And the second part is an AI culture insights engine that uses the data from the application to measure culture in real time without surveys. As a company, our vision is to realize human potential and meaning at work, and the way we do this is through creating playful, digital technology that inspires people. So from the outside, we look like a technology company. From the inside, and in reality, we're a culture company. We believe that organizational culture is the most important component of a high-performing business. And as a culture company that views success through a culture lens, we went into 2020 firmly believing that culture was one of the three essential elements of business success everywhere. That while businesses survived with a sound operating model and a solid business strategy, they only really thrived when these were aligned with a strong culture, and that culture really mattered. And that's borne out whether you're looking at company performance in stock market growth, or even retention rates of employees. Engaged, trust-based companies outperform their peers across continents. And for us, being together was always a huge part of our culture. We had a relationship with remote working before this before the lockdown started. But we found that it was the power of togetherness that was really driving success in our teams. And our culture was fed by being together, and our performance reflected this. If I could sum it up, and this might be the same in your companies, we really drove strong feelings of belonging, of community, of trust, and of shared purpose. And the office had a really huge role to play for us. It was the stage that this was all, in the most part, acted out on. And then for us, Monday the 23rd of March hit. And in an instant, we found ourselves working from home in the midst of the greatest healthcare crisis in living memory. And it made us really double down on culture. We realized we didn't have the crutch of the office anymore, and we had to really deliberately think about how we nurtured and grew the culture when we weren't together. From our point of view, and the product we put out, what was even more interesting is that we're already measuring engagement across different markets and continents through Totem. So we decided to see what the platform was telling us about the impact of engagement. And here's a stylized report, and Jamie's just about to go into it, into the data we initially saw. So we saw an explosion of engagement as the pandemic and lockdown took hold. I think that was mainly driven by people trying to recreate the office experience online. But that soon dropped off, I think, as the enormity of lockdown and the realities of home working sunk in. So we saw engagement go from generally high before lockdown to stratospheric at the beginning of lockdown, and then into rapid decline. And this happened over 4 to 5 months. Wasn't a reflection of the product, it was a reflection of the engagement shock that was being seen in companies everywhere. So to the hub of it, we decided to commission our own research to find out in more detail what was really happening with remote working. I mean, it was essential for us as a business to try and understand if seismic changes were happening and what new trends were being formed, but also critical for our partners to understand as early as possible what was unfolding and to put their particular individual experience into a wider context. So hopefully our findings can help you all build better workplace cultures wherever your people might be working. I'm going to hand over to Jamie now. Jamie's product lead and heads up our research team, and it was him and his team that carried out the hidden impact of remote working research. Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, Marcus, and hello everybody. So yeah, just a kind of brief intro on the research piece we did. So we kind of approached it using a mixed methodology. So we used formative interviews, and the role of the interviews really was to try and identify behavioural change in the participants. So indicators that they were acting differently, that they were thinking differently, or they were feeling differently. And then we used surveys to kind of explore and validate these observations and gain some statistical evidence behind the kind of trends that we saw. We took samples both at the beginning of summer and then again in autumn. And we kind of set out with the understanding that our physical surroundings play a very large role in our behaviours and the cultures and the social norms that we have at work. Architects design buildings with social interactions and our behaviour in mind. And you can consider the change in approaching your manager based on if they're sat next to your desk in an open plan office or they're sat behind an office door. The words you will use and your body language are likely to be entirely different, and this really contributes to the culture of a workplace. If we take an example, and this is just a kind of a thought experiment that we ran at the beginning, which was imagine if you gave 2 teams exactly the same problem to solve, and you placed one in a shared location, and you asked the other ones to work from home. Now, whilst both teams will deliver a solution, the solutions are likely to be very different. And the team based in the same location are more likely to be able to communicate their own individual ideas and overcome obstacles as a collective, compared to the team working remotely, who are much more likely to develop their parts of the solution in isolation and might be unaware of the obstacles that their teammates are facing. So the kind of initial objective was to identify these kind of signals from the interviews in our kind of behaviours and if the physical environment was impacting us. Now, one of the first observations we actually made was a shift in perceptions of culture. So participants who previously worked in informal office cultures, open plan offices, flatter hierarchies, they were identifying that their culture seems more formal. Conversations were much more focused about work, and interactions seemed less social and less informal. Now, on the reverse of this, individuals who'd worked in formal cultures with greater hierarchy actually felt that their culture was now informal. And this came from seeing previous managers or vice presidents or senior roles who usually only engaged with about work. All of a sudden, they were seeing them in their home environment. And this really changed, the perception of what the culture was. Now, whilst we observed positive sentiment towards home working, what we really kind of picked up on was that participants were also identifying a sense of decreasing familiarity. Now, we found this notion super interesting as it affects how we interact with one another. Now, an example of this is imagine walking into a room with your friends, and now imagine walking into a room full of strangers. How you behave and the information you're willing to share is very, very different based on this context. And it's exactly the same for your colleagues. If you feel like you don't know your colleagues, the ideas you're willing to put across, the challenges you're willing to make are very, very different. So we built a kind of behavioral theory around this observation. And this theory was that familiarity influences how we judge someone's emotional state, goals, and desires, which in turn informs our communication style and our tone. And without it, our anxiety when communicating increases and our trust decreases. In essence, teamwork becomes much, much harder. So we kind of took this and we considered how familiarity is affected by the home working and by kind of taking us outside of the shared office space. And now when we work from home, we're very reliant on verbal communication, and the digital channels we use remove any form of body language. Tonality becomes much harder to understand. We miss if someone isn't saying anything at all. We need people to be more extroverted. But our ability to be extroverted is reliant on our familiarity with the audience that we are addressing. So this, this theme that came out of the kind of interviews, we really found super interesting and wanted to explore it in more depth. So what we did is we looked to test this theory by shaping questions related to the different aspects of familiarity, such as someone's perceptions of how connected they felt with their colleagues, their ability to ask for help, their ability to collaborate. And what we looked for was signals of a negative impact on these. And what we observed was significant. So of the samples we took, 59% felt less connected with their teammates. 55% felt that collaboration as a team was becoming much harder. And 57% felt they were less able to connect with colleagues outside of their direct team. Furthermore, 50% felt it was harder to ask for help. Being unable to ask for help whilst also feeling disconnected from your colleagues and feeling that your team is no longer communicating the way that they once did creates a real risk of a sense of isolation and an increase in anxiety. And each of these indicators kind of showed us how switching from a shared physical space to isolated remote working was eroding our ability to effectively communicate with one another, because we were losing this sense of familiarity that we kind of knew each other past our kind of momentary interactions, which were very work focused via video calls. So we ran 2 surveys across over 1,000 respondents to kind of test this theory. And across those surveys, between 45 and 65% of the respondents gave us answers that indicated that they were struggling with familiarity. I was actually quite surprised by the size of this swing, because whilst we were expecting a degree of observable impact, we believe that teams that worked together prior to March 2020 would have retained their sense of familiarity with one another. And we'd assumed that turnover during the first few quarters of 2020 would have been lower than normal due to lockdown and furlough. And because of this, the impact of decreasing familiarity would have been less pronounced. So what we kind of took away from this is the impact of even the period of time from March to autumn working remotely has been significant on people's perceptions of one another, their ability to communicate, and through that, intrinsically, their connection to a company culture. What we really kind of wanted to do was make sure that there wasn't a single kind of group that was perhaps swinging the overall results. So we segmented the responses based on the kind of size of the company and the length of employee tenure. And this is based on a hypothesis that the larger the company, the more likely it was that familiarity would decrease because you're more abstracted from the kind of workings of the company, and the bigger the company, the more people, so it's harder to kind of stay in contact. And we also assumed that the newer the employees, so the shorter the employee tenure, the more likely what they were to answer negatively in terms of familiarity. Actually, when we break it down, we observed a much smaller percentage swing than we had anticipated. So whilst employees who had been enrolled for under a year were much more likely to identify with negative answers than those of a longer tenure, the variance wasn't as large as we were anticipating. And in reverse of actually our initial hypothesis, the larger the organization, the more resilient it actually appeared to be. Now we have a couple of ideas around why this might be, one of which is that larger organizations have inherently been more dispersed since their inception compared to small organizations which relied much more on the office space. And because of that, larger organizations perhaps had the processes already in place and a degree of remote working and dispersed teams, so it wasn't quite such a shock to their ways of working and ways of delivering their culture. But these are some hypotheses we're taking away to explore at the moment. The kind of key takeaway, however, was that familiarity appeared to be dropping across the board at much higher levels than we had initially anticipated. And our kind of takeaway from this was that if we faced a kind of prolonged period of remote working without some substantial changes in how we design our organizations and design our kind of services and cultures around remote working, we believe we might see the following trend. And the trend is a sharp drop in familiarity between existing employees, and an environment where new employees struggle to ever reach the levels that used to exist between their colleagues. Now, this scenario will result in significant communication problems and a risk of silos operating across the business. And all the kind of the survey questions that we shaped around communication indicated that this trend seemed to be panning out. The survey we did at the beginning of summer gave us the first signs of this. The survey we ran in autumn showed a steady increase in people identifying with kind of negative responses in terms of their ability to feel able to communicate, their familiarity with their colleagues. And this was obviously pre the current lockdown, which I feel from anecdotal evidence has been much harder on employees and has been much harder on work relationships and people's sense of connection and self with their job. So what we really kind of see here is a need for action to address, what is going to be quite a fundamental challenge to business continuity and an organization's ability to adapt and change at speed, because communication is such a fundamental part of business change. There's two kind of just anecdotal pieces we put in here, which came from some of the interviews we did. And one was from a young female who basically said their manager had messaged them asking if they were free for a chat. And because she wasn't familiar with this manager, she didn't know them personally. She only really met them via kind of computer conversations, whether that's on Zoom, whether that's an instant message. So she got a message asking if she was free for a chat. And that message lacked any of the context you would have if you knew the person well, who was kind of sending that message. So she spent several hours panicking, not being productive, just high state of anxiety, because she was unsure if she was in trouble. And she couldn't interpret from the instant message, and because she didn't really know the individual sending the instant message, she couldn't interpret what it really meant and what kind of conversation she was about to have. Likewise, a male, age 24, referenced having more calls than ever before, which I'm sure is something we can all relate to, but still feeling quite disconnected, still not feeling like that the conversations he was having really were much more than transactions. And the impact this has on us is significant, both in terms of our mental well-being, but also in terms of, as a business, how we can operate, how we communicate with each other, and how much time we have to spend trying to convey a message. I think one of the things we're taking away in the current climate is everyone is having to over-communicate everything. And the impacts on a business in that aspect is change becomes much, much harder. Change is very hard at the best of times. But if we're unable to communicate effectively, then that challenge is multiplied. So just in kind of summary of our kind of observations, working from home is leading to an overall decrease in familiarity across the board. We saw slight variance in the resilience of companies based on their size. We saw slight variance in terms of resilience of employees based on their tenure, but the variance was very, very small, and actually took us aback in terms of just how widespread the impact of home working had been across size of organizations, across the length of employment. The output, and this is something that came out a lot because a lot of people felt productivity, which was quite an easy measure to kind of keep track of. Output felt the same, but what we were observing is the impact to teams and their ability to communicate meant that the outcomes of that work could be very, very different. So whereas, and if we go back to the thought experiment at the beginning of the kind of talk, whereas a team in the same location are able to work as a collective and combine their ideas, when everyone's working in isolation, the outcomes that they're creating, whilst they might be still hitting productivity levels, the outcomes might not be as good as they were if they're in the same location. A lack of visibility in the background of this makes it much harder to ask for help. So if you don't feel familiar with one another, if I'm not comfortable sharing certain information with somebody who I don't feel I know, makes it really hard for me to ask for help. And then because we lack the physical space, it's much harder for managers to observe if someone needs help. We miss body language. We miss if someone's not saying anything. Usually in the office, if someone is very quiet, you'll be able to see that. You'll be able to observe it in their body language. But at the moment, we're entirely reliant on employees to kind of put their hand up, be an extrovert, flag an issue, and that creates real problems. As I mentioned, tenure is a factor, but decline in familiarity is broadly universal. And if this is an ongoing kind of plan for remote working, whether it's enforced on us by COVID or whether companies decide to move to a fully remote model, the ability of your business and the design of your business to help build familiarity is going to be so important, because otherwise you will have a team who fundamentally don't really know each other. And yeah, this decline affects every business regardless of size. SMEs seem to be more exposed. We made some assumptions around their businesses and the fact that they are very interpersonal based businesses. They don't have the processes set up of much larger organizations for dispersed working. But even large organizations were showing signs of impact. So yeah, that's kind of initial overview of our kind of findings. I'm going to hand it back over to Marcus now to talk through some of the ideas and concepts we had around, how can you tackle some of these challenges?
Super. Thank you very much, Jamie. So as Jamie said, now for the so what? What can we all do? Not just to survive, I think, but also to actively thrive, whether that's in a remote world or a hybrid world. How can we design culture for a future state which isn't particularly clear at the moment? Based on the research that Jamie and the team did, we've identified 5 key areas that I'd like to share now that we think will be essential going forward into a hybrid world. So in no particular order, number 1, measure and measurement. I think there's a fundamental problem or an obstacle that we face as a company, which is how do you measure employee experience and culture and understand realities without an office observable perspective? And I think the other point to make is that our armory here is a bit weak. For most companies, all they have are surveys. And while surveys can be a really good data point as one of a number of data points, used exclusively, I think they pose problems. And certainly we've seen a growth of those problems over the last few months. There's a definite growing trend of survey fatigue, where people are just being overwhelmed by surveys. We're seeing increased kind of friction in completion of surveys, lower completion rates, and also a perceived slow feedback loop. The time taken to get insights and then to share the insights with the people who have given you the information to get the insights. So what can we do if we have to exclusively rely on surveys? I think number one clearly is to make sure survey insights are gained as quickly as possible, especially in a fast changing environment when you know, people's experience of work is changing quite radically, quite quickly. That leads on to a need to complete the feedback loop, to give information back to employees that you've gleaned through their help in answering surveys as soon as possible. And then the knock-on advantage of that is it helps completion rates. If people understand that by giving insight, they will be receiving more complete insight across the cohort, then it helps to motivate people to really complete surveys. And then a final point of making sure employees understand the actions that the survey insight will now drive. I think it's all a product of us having to rely in lots of companies pretty exclusively on surveys. Incidentally, and Jamie mentioned it in his piece just before, we found that during our research, the interviews we conducted added a huge amount of context to the data we collected. So the anecdotal evidence adds a huge amount of perspective and explanation as to what lies behind the data. It's kind of obvious, really, but we really need to speak to people. We really can't just rely on faceless surveys. That anecdotal conversational insight gives really good perspective alongside the data. And I think a final takeaway, going back to this reliance on surveys, is for all of us to think about the other measures we could look at other than surveys. You know, for example, we use always on culture insights, which helps us incredibly. But for those companies that don't have that, are there other data points that they could look at? I don't know what it might be in the kind of digital arsenal of that company, but it might be performance measures. It might be usage or kind of content analysis of recognition software. It could be data from your engagement software. Whatever it may be, it's looking for those other avenues that you can glean data from, and all of us can fly slightly less blind. There's a wider question clearly, which is about data-led HR. You know, clearly we need to get smarter about data. Marketing, finance, operations, sales teams have had access to high quality real-time data for years now and couldn't run their parts of the business without it. HR, I think, has been sold a bit short, and there's a wider piece here about data-led HR. So number one, measurement, really key. Number two, this idea of building for remote. You know, it's clear that the largest kind of single blocker to change in an organization is its willingness to adapt existing ways of working. Clearly, we're in a position where employees' needs at home are very different to when they're in the office. And we can't just shift our existing office-based processes online. I speak personally. It's something that we tried to do at the beginning of the lockdown. It just didn't work. You know, instead, we then had to move to a position where we're listening to employees' needs and then trying to redesign the processes around them. And you know, what might that mean? For us, that means examining what asynchronous working looks like. It doesn't really make sense in an office when you've got everyone to turn up at the same time, the same day, the same place. But once we're not in the same place together, there's opportunities to examine what asynchronous working looks like. Clearly, new tools is going to be a huge part of this. And within that, the kind of conversations that we have, and you know, internally, but also with partners, is thinking about how employees are seen and heard, and how employees see and hear when they're remote, because it's very different from being in an office. Even that whole office piece is clearly going to is going to go through a lot of disruption. I think most of our partners will be keeping an office, but it will be very different. In many cases, it will be smaller. In many cases, it will be completely reconfigured. And the office, kind of an acceptance that the office is no longer the exclusive place of work. It needs to be reframed, because in a hybrid world, and well, it doesn't even exist in a remote world, but in a hybrid world, it won't be the only stage that work plays out in. It will be one of a number of stages, and those stages clearly will be digital stages. And finally, just a final point on building for remote. We know that key moments in an employee's experience shape their sentiment towards their employer. Not just that, their sentiment towards their role and their colleagues. So whether it's onboarding all the way through to exit, we need to identify the moments that matter most to our employees and make sure they're supported remotely, regardless of an employee's location. This building for remote is quite seismic, I think, and really challenges basic assumptions and the levers that we used to have when we were exclusively relying on an office. So number 3, and again, something borne out really clearly in Jamie's research, Signpost help and support. I think whether you're a new starter or an old timer, we've seen it's becoming harder to ask for help. And the implication of that is that it's vital to help our teams feel safe to ask questions. I think managers can really lead the way here. I think it's more critical than ever for management and leadership to signpost support for their teams, and a need, and we're seeing this through the data on our platform, but also through our partner conversations, an understanding that leaders have to really lean in. Jamie spoke about being more extroverted, but to really be accessible, to really be visible, to really be open, to really be colleague focused. We're at a point really where if employees won't go to the mountain has to go to employees. Otherwise we risk a serious loss of familiarity and just distance and decoupling of people from the business. I think we also need to think about how to facilitate conversation and collaboration that is to a degree unscheduled. Adding another Zoom call in the diary doesn't have to be the default answer. I certainly feel this personally, and I know in our partner network it's felt, a need for a place to start conversations that are unstructured, conversations that don't have a defined agenda and a defined output, because life remote otherwise can be completely structured and completely scheduled. And while that's damaging for our own personal relationships and our own health, it also has an incredible impact on the outcomes that we're trying to build as companies. I work and lead a creative company that has huge implications if we can't have unstructured conversations. So very important, signposting help and support, and leaders really leaning in. Point 4 is connected and looks at that visibility piece. It's clear that sharing digitally, like we're doing at the moment, is here to stay and is only going to grow. But it's finding a way to share digitally that isn't just transactional. So much of what we do now feels transactional. We need ways to keep teams up to date on, new projects, recognition, acknowledging wins. Actually, we found that it really drives candor and trust and transparency if you can also acknowledge business losses, and it's a crucial part of staying connected. Another crucial piece is celebrating the small things. We've seen a big drop-off in recognition, particularly over the last few months, which is really damaging because it just leads to this narrative of being isolated. So that ability to take time to communicate and recognize not just the big moments, but the really small micro moments that impact lives and bring people closer together is very important. What we've also seen is that people want to hear from the leaders, even when there's no kind of seismic market shaking update to give. It's very easy at the moment to see every day as a Groundhog Day, and to feel that nothing's really changed and we're still looking at the same view out the same window and we don't have anything particularly interesting to share. I think leaders need to strive to be over visible at the moment. being present and authentic online, I think gives teams the opportunity to feel connected, and just as importantly, it gives them permission to also connect and to also share parts of their lives and be visible. And finally, point 5, and although these are in no particular order, I think this is the, if I had to pick one, I think this is the most important one, and also the one that came out most in Jamie's research, which is around maintaining connections. Visibility, connectedness, familiarity, they're all dropping, and that has serious implications for everyone, both at an individual level, but at an organizational level in terms of speed and trust. So it's really important that we ensure that we maintain relationships outside of the day-to-day doing. It goes back to the transactional piece. We can do that through various ways. I mean, one is by having spaces and channels that allow non-scripted, non-agenda conversations where we can build connections. Another one is just by being over visible and striving to over communicate, to put ourselves out there so we can fight isolation and disconnection, and also give permission to everyone else to do the same. So there are our 5 kind of go-to insights that we got from the research. If I could sum up very quickly: measure how people are feeling and how the culture's changing. Surveys are blunt. Are there other things you have? Number 2, build for remote. Don't just try and shoehorn previous working practices into a remote or hybrid setup. Very, very clearly, we heard the need to signpost, help and support. Also champion visibility and recognition, and then finally maintain connections, build familiarity. Familiarity is interesting. It can sound a bit lightweight. It's not. It's the first step towards creating bonds that ultimately lead to trust, speed, teamwork, happiness at work, and it comes through connections and essentially familiarity. So thank you very much for listening. Really enjoyed sharing our research with you today. I'll go back to Bogdan.
Thanks very much, Marcus and Jamie. Brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed listening to that. It's now time to answer your questions. So if you have any questions, do send them in. We've had a few come in already. Can the suggestions you've provided work for a hybrid setup or fully return to the office setup?
Thanks. So I'll take that, but then I'll
okay.
pass on to Jamie, who's the brains. So I think so. Absolutely for a hybrid setup, and I'd go further and say really necessary for a hybrid setup. And I don't want it to be doom and gloom, because actually the opportunity for us to redefine what work looks and feels like is priceless, isn't it? We were given a way of working by our parents' generation that we never questioned, and the opportunity for us to actually be thoughtful about it and to carve out something better that drives business success, but also human happiness through work is something to be celebrated. I think what is going to be tricky is getting a stage, a canvas that you can drive familiarity and connection that works both in a work setting, as in fully at work, but also in a hybrid setting. And it will be that interplay between the two spaces, the physical space and the digital space, that will define success. Which is why I think digital has to be an answer to this, because if we rely exclusively on the work levers we had to drive kind of culture and familiarity, then it will discriminate against those people who aren't in work all the time. Certainly from my teams, there'll be people who I know will want to be in the office 5 days a week. There will also be people who perhaps want to be in the office once or twice a month. And if I'm relying on the office to be the canvas, then there's that it's going to discriminate and not be equitable to everyone in the business. Jamie, I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
No, I think I'd agree. I think the over-reliance on the office in some ways has probably made us a little bit lazy in how we approach building culture, helping someone. I'm doing some work on onboarding at the moment, and the role of the office was so important in onboarding. We actually didn't put enough thought into what happens if the office isn't there and we have to bring someone into the company. So I think designing for a remote first kind of approach, so you know that you can support your employee wherever they are, systematically support, so they have the same experience whether they're at home or in the office, is so important. And the opportunity it opens, whilst there's a lot of challenges we are facing at the moment, it opens up huge opportunities to allow employees to have a slightly different work-life balance, to support employees in what really works for them, whether that's they need more time at home, whether they need more time in the office. The research showed that people generally have quite split views on what they want to do. Most people don't indicate they didn't want to return to the office full time, but there was variance in terms of did they want to be in there, half the week, 4 or 5 days worth of the week, or they just wanted to work remotely entirely. So I think as businesses, we've really got to be able to design our services and our internal ways of working to support that, and doing so opens up opportunity both for the employee, but also for the business itself in terms of access to talent, abilities to look at your kind of cost models when it comes to your office space. So there's huge opportunity, as long as we focus on it in the right way.
Thanks, guys. Got another question. What if the senior leadership are not on board with these sort of suggestions?
Jamie, do you want to take that one and then I can follow up?
Yeah. I mean, the best way of approaching that is supplying them the information that demonstrates that this is an issue. The data that we were able to gather demonstrated quite clearly that there was a problem. And you can use that, you can gather that whether it be by survey, whether it by your own kind of internal mechanisms. But what really built that kind of picture was more anecdotal evidence that we gathered through interviews. And by combining clear indicators of change along with anonymized anecdotal evidence from the staff saying like this is a problem, this isn't working, or I feel this way, is the kind of best way to show that something needs to happen, action needs to be taken. And off the back of that, you then combine that with the opportunities which can be obtained if you're able to drive the change. So start with what the problem is, and then identify what the opportunity is, and providing you present that in a cohesive narrative, then it usually brings around people to the fact that something needs to happen. And I think change is always a journey, and communicating it is always the most critical factor. So gather your evidence, create the narrative, identify the opportunity, and then present that in a cohesive manner. And that is, the first step towards change. And you'll still encounter resistance, but what it really is winning over certain allies by presenting this kind of clear narrative to help starting instigate that change.
Thank you. And another question: what sort of things have you been doing with your colleagues to increase or maintain familiarity?
I can take that. So I mean, it's I'm wary about giving myself an example of best practice, but just to let you know what we've started doing, and it's very simple, and so far it's really working, and actually it's supporting me a lot as well, and not just, I hope, supporting my colleagues. So if you think about the championing visibility piece, I think it's really, really important, and not just for me, but the whole leadership team. So every Monday between 4 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I have a completely open video call. It's almost like a surgery session, having a virtual open office. Anyone can rock up and talk about anything for any particular amount of time for 2 hours every week. I was worried that no one would attend, or I was worried that people would attend just to be seen to be attending, and it would be kind of some horrible digital presenteeism. And those two things haven't been true at all. So I get a steady stream of colleagues that might not seen for a week or two, that will pop in, and it will be everything from talking about plans for the weekend to worrying about the roadmap on a specific feature item. So everything from the real work stuff to the far more collegiate and social. It helps me personally, great, to a large degree. It helps me feel less isolated. Been running it for about 6 to 8 weeks now, and they're really well attended, and they feel very, very natural. So it's just a way that I can kind of champion visibility. We're also trying to do as much as we can around signposting help. For us, a lot of that help isn't really navigating the company. It's around our mental health and being very mindful of our mental health and understanding what different support we have within the business to support all of us in our mental health and to speak really openly about it.
There's a further kind of piece around, it's more of a tactical design solution to this, which is when we think about bringing someone into the team, so much of what we'd usually get from the office is those initial introductions, a little bit of background on someone, and preparing almost little profiles on team members. So when you bring someone new in, they automatically are able to gain little bits of anecdotal information around who this person is, making sure that there is a face to a name. These things go really, really far in terms of helping someone relax a little bit. The worst case scenario that we've observed is, someone joins a team or moves teams or for whatever reason, they're a different part of the business, and they don't know who they're working with, and everyone is just an avatar, and they don't know anything personal about that individual. So in terms of how you're designing your organization, it's just how do you design for that issue? How do you make sure that when someone first meets somebody, they see a face to a name, they see something more personal of that individual than just, a job title and a brief kind of Zoom meeting. So yeah, kind of designing solutions around that as well.
Cool, thanks guys. Another question, how would you advise approaching fatigue towards over communication or visibility following initial great take up of shared activities, i.e. quizzes, virtual pub nights, etc.? Engagement is now decreased. How do you revitalize that?
It's a really, really good question. I'll jump in first. It's a really good question because it was great. We all got onto team quizzes and did loads of kind of social stuff in the early days, and then that could kind of get a bit tiring. I think the key there is having communities or having methods of engagement that people can accept on their own terms, that people can passively engage with if they want to, and can actively engage with if they really want to. I think it's hard when there's a one size fits all, and we've noticed, we play Among Us together on Friday evenings, and the amount of people who play it has changed over time. What we found is really successful is we have a work social network that allows everyone to communicate and be visible to the extent that they want to communicate and be visible. Social networks are very good for this, aren't they? Because you can, if you want to be out there, you can post, and you can shout loud. But actually, also, if you want to be a bit more passive and not quite as extroverted, your engagement might be liking things. It might just be commenting on things. It might be reading things, but not actually interacting. So I think the key there is to find ways that you can engage together, but on the terms that the individual feels most comfortable with. Jamie, I don't know if you've got.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something I can relate to because I myself feel fatigue towards certain group events. I think it's just how do we contextualize that? So is it really a failure of what we're doing, or as Marcus has said, is it actually just the more passive actors in our kind of teams and our culture? It's not really wanting to do that. It's not benefiting them. That doesn't mean it's a failure of the activity. It's just not the right method to engage them. And so I think it's looking at across your business, how are you engaging in lots of different ways? So for some people, these kind of events really help them, and they enjoy taking the stage and being part of the team and communicating as much as possible. For other actors, that isn't actually what they need. And Marcus kind of pointed towards, we use a kind of social network within our company, where some people again will post a lot more than others, but everyone gets to see it. and everyone gets to observe it and feel like they kind of know a little bit more about the people that are posting. You know, you can reflect this on other social networks where some people post a lot, some people won't post very much, but people are active and engaged with it, and it gives them something back in terms of they feel part of that society or that, you know, certain cultural segment. So yeah, I think it's important to look at these events as successes. You know, the fact anybody is showing up is a success. And if numbers drop, don't automatically view it as a negative sign. You know, just simply view it as, you know, certain actors in the team who are not engaged by this. So what is the best way to make sure they are engaged? And, you know, reach out to them and make sure they're okay, and make sure there's other kind of channels going on to support them, you know, feel part of something and feel part of more than just waking up every day and completing some tasks.
I think it just as a postscript, I think it, you know, my view, it goes back to a comment I would have made earlier. You know, if people won't come to you for the scheduled events, then you need to find ways that you'll go to them on their terms. And so having different sorts of engagement mechanics that are appropriate for, you know, different personalities and different positions that people in the company are in can work really well. Going back to the social network piece, what's interesting about it is clearly we get huge amounts of non-identifiable but very valid data off the back of it, and so we can see that engagement with that is, you know, from our perspective, is higher than it's ever been. Doesn't mean that, you know, there's more posts than there's ever been, but it means people are checking out and have the ability to engage to the level and to the extroversion level that they feel most comfortable with.
Thank you very much. And I think we've got time for one more question. What's your view on the danger of silos forming now there is no water cooler?
Great question. Jamie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, significant would be my answer to that. I think if you're siloed within your team and then almost siloed yourself if you feel isolated, you know, as a business, our ability to do work effectively is based on our ability to communicate, especially in service-based industries, especially in the type of work we're doing now, which is more and more around critical thinking than just simple kind of process tasks, completion rates. You know, in the current climate, all organizations are having to adapt at speed to be able to survive. And if you have any familiarity with organizational change, then you know that communicating and bringing people on that journey is such the mainstay of change management. If you have silos all over the business, then your ability to change is severely inhibited. You can't communicate why you're doing things. Teams won't know why they're being asked to change. Teams won't want to change. Ability to bring teams together to work collaboratively is going to be much, much harder. You know, you're creating basically barriers all across your business to be able to achieve good outcomes. You know, and what those water cooler moments really do is it helps you meet and familiarize with individuals who you otherwise wouldn't talk to quite so much. So whether that's someone from a different team, whether that's someone from management, whether that's someone that at some point in your career you might need to engage with, it's much, much harder to do that when you don't know them. And likewise for management, it's much, much harder to communicate to the teams and the staff if they don't feel connected and they don't feel like they know you. So yeah, I think the risk of silos emerging is a significant one, a very real one. From the conversations we had and the surveys we ran, you know, you can see the indicators of that happening. You can see people not really knowing what's going on outside their little bubble, and frankly not caring that much. And because of that, if you want to instigate change, it's going to be super hard to bring those people on board and to get them to kind of come on that journey with you.
Just to add to that, I think it's a great question. It goes to the heart of familiarity. It's also something which behind the scenes we're trying to work out how we can measure, because our sense is that organizations are becoming far more siloed. My assumption would be it's because because work and our communications are so much more transactional than they've ever been. That's what's driving it. You know, the water cooler allows us to have completely unscheduled, non-transactional, non-agendarized conversations, which are becoming far harder. So practically for us, that means we want to figure out a way, we think we can do it, how we can measure the siloedness of organizations, but B, thinking about strategies where you can encourage non-scheduled, non-transactional conversations. You know, whether that's, you know, different sharing sessions where different parts of the business on a frequent basis share what they're doing, whether that's a way that you can create informal ad hoc groups laterally across the business, so across what would otherwise be silos. But clearly we need ways that we can have unscheduled, non-scripted conversations, because life on Zoom is very scripted and very scheduled.
Thank you very much. Really insightful answers there, guys. And thank you once again for the brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed it. If you'd like to discover more about Ciphr Connect or Totem's digital culture platform, do get in touch by emailing info@ciphr.com and go to totem.team, or opt in to find out more using the exit survey you'll see after this webinar. That survey will ask you for a bit of feedback about today's broadcast, which will help us improve our future webinars. So do take a couple of minutes to fill it in if you can. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at another future Ciphr webinar. Have a great day. Goodbye.